All right, welcome to everyone here and welcome to those who are online. You see a title like Military Access to Bedrock of U.S. Power Projection, and you just think, like, is that of interest today? But um, super timely topic. I'm so excited that we have Dr. Rachel Metz here today. I've known Rachel so long that I knew her before she was a doctor and before she was a Metz. So I'm really pleased that she's here at CSAC today. She's an assistant professor of political science and international affairs at George Washington University. Her research and teaching interests are quite broad in the area of international security, focusing on security assistance and security cooperation, military effectiveness, nuclear strategy, and methods for studying military operations. Her book project examines the United States' approach to building militaries in partner states, and she's published in a wide range of academic journals and other outlets, international organization, international security, security studies, and the like, as well as places like Diplo, War on the Rocks, National Interest, and the Washington Post. She received her PhD in political science from MIT in this political science and in the security studies program. And it's a great delight to have her here today. Thanks for coming.
Thank you for having me, everybody. So, Jim, that was a great introduction, but you left out the most important part of my bio, which is I have a 415 area code. I'm a San Francisco native. So I wanted to thank all of you for giving me a reason to come home to the Bay. It's really nice to be here. Okay, so when Harold and Jim Furon, reached out to invite me to present here, I had to decide whether I was going to present, my first book project, which focused on U.S. Efforts to build militaries in partner states. I ended up deciding not to go that route, mainly because I really wanted to take this opportunity with this group to present newer research that could really benefit from your questions and feedback, because it's really at the early stages, it's early days. So there's really a lot of room to incorporate the conversation that we have here today into this new work, which focuses on wartime access. And I'm now especially glad that I went this route because of this. So the United States is at war. The US and Israel just decapitated the Iranian regime and are, it seems, destroying the Iranian Navy and military infrastructure. So this war is a lot of things to a lot of people, but one thing it definitely is, whether you're for it or against it, is a formidable display of US military power in a country over 10,000 kilometers away from the United States. So this war against Iran is a particularly large scale and dramatic display of US combat power overseas, but Operation Epic Fury is just the latest example of a consistent pattern. Just in the last year alone, the US military has struck targets in 7 countries across 3 continents. I might be missing countries. This is my count. Let me know if I'm missing some. Turning back the clock, since 1945, the US has fought wars or struck targets in countries including, but definitely not limited to, Korea, Vietnam, Grenada, Panama, Iraq, Somalia, Kosovo, Afghanistan, Iraq again, Libya, Iran, Iraq again, Syria, Iran again. So, and looking forward to a hypothetical future, the Pentagon is planning for the defense of Taiwan against a PRC naval blockade or amphibious invasion scenario. So a hallmark of the post-1945 world has been the United States projection of combat power all around the world. But the world is all the way over there and we're all the way over here. And so my question is, how does the United States do this? How has the United States made the entire world its sphere of influence? Kenneth Boulding told us about the loss of strength gradient. George Blaney taught us about the tyranny of distance. John Mersheimer of the stopping power of water. Different ways of making the same point, which is it's supposed to be hard for even very strong states to project military power far away. So even states with the most powerful militaries in the world, like the United States, are supposed to have trouble bringing that military power to bear the farther from home they roam. And yet, again, the whole world is the United States sphere of influence. So how's the United States done this? The United States has a few strategies for projecting military power around the world. One is acquisition and outright conquest. The United States became an imperial power at the close of the Spanish-American War. Think of the acquisition of Puerto Rico, Guam, the Philippines. And today, the U.S. retains control of territories scattered around the world outside the contiguous United States. Okay, so conquest and acquisition, that's one strategy. Another strategy is long-range weapon systems, strategic bombers, ICBMs, capable of launching from the continental United States and landing on targets all around the world. And of course, the third strategy of power projection is the aircraft carrier. So these are floating bases that the United States can send to coastal waters near to targets. Naval aviation can do a lot of the missions that tactical air can do, with some reservations. But there are limitations to each of these approaches. So conquest was out of vogue. It might be making a comeback, but generally it's frowned upon to try to acquire or conquer other states. And even if the current administration might be have a little less compunction about conquest, there's a risk, and that's the risk that states don't want to be conquered and might try to stop you from doing that. So conquest limitations. Long-range weapon systems also have significant drawbacks. So nuclear-armed ICBMs are rarely the best way to solve a regional dispute. And strategic bombers are useful for certain military missions, but not for all of them. They're also tied to land. So a strategic bomber might be able to get from here all the way to there, all around the world, without touching down. But the tankers that are refueling it in the air, it's helpful to be able to stop somewhere on land. And aircraft carriers are also pretty tied to land. So this is the best power projection tool that the US military has, but everybody on the aircraft carriers got to eat, and they can be supplied at sea, but the supply ships have to stop at ports to get supplied. And the carrier wing also needs fuel. So again, the supply ships have to tie to land. So limitations to the United States' first three strategies of projecting military power. So there's a fourth strategy for projecting military power, and that's access. So the United States' primary strategy for collapsing the tyranny of distance, flattening the loss of strength gradient, and overcoming the stopping power of water is wartime access. What wartime access can do and has done for the US is make every adversary in the world a next door neighbor. The United States isn't limited to long-range weapon systems from the continental US or from its territories. It's not limited to naval aviation. The US can bring all of its air and land power to bear against adversaries by positioning them in and fighting from inside the borders of other states. So in my new research on wartime access, this new stream of work, I'm envisioning this as a series of articles and possibly a second book project. I ask three questions. What is wartime access? How does it vary? How does wartime access affect the military power of US-led coalitions? And why do states grant, restrict, or deny wartime access to the United States? I'm going to touch briefly on the first two questions. That's where I focused on on a talk I gave earlier today with the IR workshop at Stanford. So I'm going to focus most of my time here on this last question, this question of why do states let the US military fight from inside their borders? Okay, so what is access? So I break access into two categories: peacetime access and wartime access. So in peacetime, the US military, its people, its stuff are scattered all over the world. Peacetime access can come in a lot of different shapes and sizes and legal arrangements. The US operates and owns and operates hundreds of bases and installations inside the sovereign territory of other states. So this is Patuxent in Greenland, Camp Humphreys, South Korea. And over here is the Robertson Barracks. This is not a US base, an Australian base that US Marines operate through regularly. So all shapes and sizes for peacetime access. But what I'm focusing on primarily in my work is wartime access. And so wartime access. So not only does the US military forward deploy and pre-position and transit through other states in peacetime, but it also fights from inside the borders of sovereign states in war. That's what it's doing right now in Iran. So thinking about how this war, what the shape of this war is, there's a lot of naval aviation going on, but there are also F-35s and F-22s that are fighting, and I think that they're fighting from inside the borders of states in the region. So it's a little bit of a murky information environment. It's a little hard to figure out exactly what's happening from where, but this is a war that is certainly being fought in part from inside the borders of partner states. So the United States' primary strategy for collapsing the tyranny of distance and overcoming the stopping power of water is wartime access. Okay, so what is it and how does it vary? So a simple definition: decisions by states to let other states fight wars from inside their borders. So wartime access can take three, and I consider these ideal type values: granted, restricted, or denied. So granted is yes to everything the US might ask for. Denied is no to everything, and restricted is yes to some things, no to other things. So the US might ask for overflight or to use territory for logistical purposes, or for direct combat operations. So states can say yes or no to whatever they want to say yes or no to, but a common way to restrict access is to say yes to the overflight and the logistics and no to the combat operations. Okay, so how does wartime access affect the military power of US-led coalitions? I have a working paper that's really focused on the empirical meat behind the claim that it affects the military power of US coalitions a lot. So in the working paper I share with the IR workshop earlier today, I elaborate a theory linking wartime access to coalition military power. And I argue that wartime access dramatically increases the combat power that US-led coalitions bring to bear in war. So I use multiple methods to get after this. So first, I look at 7 air wars that the US has led since World War II. And I count up the number of sorties that the United States conducted from inside the borders of sovereign states. And I compare that number to the number of sorties that the United States conducted from inside its own territory or from the sea, and the number of sorties conducted by US allies. So, and I find that across 7 operations, over 50% of total coalition air power was produced from inside the borders of partner states. So that's over half of total, barely, but over half of total coalition air power attributable to wartime access. So in that paper, I emphasize that all of our burden sharing debates really center on this category of allied sorties. What aircraft, what personnel, what troops are you sending to fight a war? What are you spending on your defense in peacetime? It's really the focus of a lot of policy discourse and a lot of international relations scholarship. But really the primary form of military cooperation in asymmetric coalitions like US-led wars overseas is this form of military cooperation, this wartime access form. So in that work, I also use the method of campaign analysis, a method I've worked on in the past to model a US effort to defend or to deny China air superiority in a hypothetical blockade scenario or invasion scenario. So I use a pretty simple sortie generation model to demonstrate that in a nutshell, there's no US-led defense of Taiwan without wartime access to bases inside the borders of allies and partners in the region. So I just wanted to flag and give a shout out to a really good article that my colleague at GW, Nick Anderson, and Daryl Press just put out, kind of modeling a few different elements of this problem. And I'm kind of revising the way I model to build on some of their work. But in a nutshell, if the US wants to be able to deny China air superiority, which would be a pretty key task in these invasion or blockade scenarios, it would have a very hard time doing that without wartime access. Okay, so having established that wartime access is a major and an IR relations scholarship largely overlooked driver of US military power around the world, I want to turn to this million-dollar question, and the one I'm going to focus on for the rest of the talk. That's why do states so often allow the US military to fight wars from inside their borders? Why do they so often grant but sometimes restrict or deny wartime access? Okay, so permission has been the defining feature of the post-1945 world. The US military usually gets yes. And it's because of this permission that the US has been able to assert military power all over the world. But states don't always let the United States in. So famously, Turkey shocked the United States when it denied access for the Northern Invasion Front in 2003. And we're also seeing this play out right now in the war in Iran. We've heard some denials from Spain. We've seen some blocks, maybe temporary, from the UK. And it's still unclear to me which of the Gulf states are saying yes and no and to what. Okay, so what do we know about this question? What does existing literature tell us about why states might deny, grant, restrict wartime access? So the first thing I want to emphasize is, this is an alignment decision. So you'd think that the alliances in alignment literature would have a lot to say about it, but it's almost completely absent from this gigantic, mature, canonical IR literature. There's almost no scholarship that acknowledges wartime access as a form of military cooperation, much less explains it. That's also true of the coalitions literature. I think that's basically by definition. I think the way that coalitions are defined is amalgams of troops and forces coming together to fight side by side. So by definition, that literature tends to exclude this form of military cooperation, wartime access. That's so important. There is a peacetime basing literature that I think is pretty interesting. It's small, but it's interesting, and it focuses mostly on the domestic politics around basing and how domestic politics kind of shape states' decisions to put restrictions on peacetime access. There's also a single RAND report that I'd like to flag by Stacey Pettijohn and Jennifer Kavanaugh on this question. So one takeaway from this literature is that there really isn't a whole lot on the question itself, but I don't want to not do justice to the literature, this literature does offer a few ideas for where these decisions might come from. And one of them is just security, traditional security alignment motivations. So what drives states to make any decisions to cooperate with a great power in war? Bandwagoning, balancing and bandwagoning, balance of threat, expectations of who's going to win the war. What can the great power offer that state in exchange for access? So just a lot of this work doesn't ask the same question, but offers some possible explanations. And the domestic politics piece, this comes out a lot in the peacetime basing literature. So it suggests domestic politics is something to look for in state decisions. Okay. But in developing a theory of wartime access, I really wanted to start by thinking about what makes wartime access unique and different from the perspective of an access granting state. And I think there are two factors that together make wartime access decisions distinct. And the first is that the war is actually happening. There isn't some hypothetical fear of entrapment. The entrapment is happening. To offer the US military access to fight a war is to say, yes, I will be part of the battlefield. So it's not some hypothetical future, something to think might be a risk. It's no, you're gonna join the battlefield. So the war is happening, it's real. And the second factor is proximity. Not only is the war happening, it's happening next door. The reason the US wants access is because of your proximity. If you are within a helpful range for the United States, if the US can fly F-22s or F-16s from your state to hit targets in a neighbor, you're probably also within range of the target. So this proximity leads to some distinct differences. All right, so there are four factors that I think these two factors shape, four motivations that I think are shaped by the combination of the two things that together make wartime access unique. So first is that small, even weak states are suddenly positioned to provide something really concretely valuable to the United States. So you have a tiny military, maybe you might send troops, token contributions of forces to a coalition in Afghanistan, something. But here, if you are geographically proximate, you can really actually add concrete military value to a battlefield in a way that you usually can't. And so there might be an expectation that, oh, this is really an opportunity to really get some alliance benefits or alignment benefits from the state because I can offer something. But proximity in an actual war also elevates the risk of retaliation. And I'm going to spend a lot of time on retaliation because I think it's a really interesting part of this story. Spillover. If you're close to chaos, if you're close to a war, if there's a war next door, you might receive refugee flows, there might be trade disruptions. There's a whole lot of reason that this war is going to spill over and affect you in a variety of ways. And finally, domestic politics. This isn't going to be a low-key, unsalient issue in your population. Deciding to fight a war, and by allowing the US to fight a war from inside your borders, that's not neutrality. That is joining a war on the side of the United States against probably a neighbor. That's probably going to be pretty resonant with the domestic population. Not necessarily negative, but not something that people aren't going to notice. So I want to talk a little bit more about each of these factors. Okay. So these expectations of alignment benefits. So there's a pretty large literature showing that for many reasons, states have a whole lot of reason to do nice things for the United States in hopes that the largest, most powerful state in the world would do nice things for them in return. This really comes down to a balance of power. The US is the strongest state in the system. I'm focusing on the 1945 to the present period. So states have a lot of reason to think, if I can align with the United States, that's probably going to be good for me. And states suddenly find themselves in a position to provide some value. And so this is an opportunity for states to gain alignment benefits from the state they most want to gain alignment benefits from. Okay, but pushing in the opposite direction in this kind of umbrella of security variables that states are considering when deciding about their access decisions is this fear of retaliation. So the proximity that it makes the state valuable for power projection also makes it vulnerable to retaliation. Granting wartime access means becoming part of a live battlefield. So you'd think that states would really weigh against each other or the benefits of aligning with the United States against the probability and damage of getting retaliation. But the United States can often, to varying degrees, credibly promise to protect the access granting state from retaliation. To varying degrees, right? So I'm sorry about this photo. I took a photo on my phone of CNN as I was watching coverage of Operation Epic Fury, because I thought this would be like a good thing to grab for this presentation. So this is a big but, this protection from retaliation piece, a really big but. So one of the things I'm thinking about is how the military technology, drones, long-range missiles, could reshape retaliation expectations and make states really think twice about whether they can expect protection from retaliation. I'll come back to that. Okay, spillover. So proximity to a live war raises the risk that states are going to receive inflows of refugees, separatist groups might be emboldened, trade routes are going to be transformed into war zones. So granting access, is that just going to contribute to chaos in the neighborhood and push you against access? But on the other hand, once the United States has decided to fight a war, you're going to get that chaos no matter what, right? You're going to get the spillover regardless of whether you help. And maybe if you help, you could get some help back from the United States managing that spillover. So putting these variables together, alignment benefits and managed concerns about retaliation and managed concerns of spillover, the balance of the security conditions end up netting towards granting access. So, but I do want to emphasize here this scope condition, or this case universe that I'm focusing on, this state's decisions to grant, restrict, or deny access to the United States in the 1945 to present period. That's a big bracket right there. And it matters a lot because the value of aligning with the United States really hinges on the United States' preponderance of power. So if that starts to go away, it'll take lower costs for states to think, not worth it. Also, if that goes away, is the US going to be able to credibly offer protection? The US is going to fight a state like China. Can the US credibly promise to protect access granting states from missiles? It would be pretty tricky. Okay. But in this period that I'm talking about, this period of 1945 to the present, really high alignment benefits and pretty managed concerns about retaliation and spillover. Okay, so what does point in the opposite direction? So let's talk about domestic politics. So domestic politics of wartime access can vary quite a lot. Granting access to the US military to fight a war, it's a choice to join the war on the US side. It's not neutrality. And it tends to be pretty highly politically salient, both to elites and to the public in a state. It can be a strong rah, 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 yes salient, or it can be a strong no salient, but it's rarely, don't really care one way or the other. Okay, so drivers of domestic political support or opposition could include a wide range of things. So, elites might worry about retaliation. Maybe they don't. Maybe their elites have conflicting opinions about the security benefits of aligning. Identity, Arab states inviting the US in to fight another Arab state. That's going to be a factor shaping domestic politics. Legitimacy of the operation. Is there a UN authorization? Is there something that makes it? Is this a just war? That could also shape domestic politics. Unexpected economic impacts can also shape the the domestic politics. So whereas the security variables, I think on net in this period tend to point towards, yes, the domestic politics can point any which way. Okay, so when they point against, what states can do is deny access to avoid domestic political repercussions altogether, or they can impose pretty heavy restrictions on what the access looks like to make it as invisible as possible to the domestic audiences. So restrictions can, if you reduce the size of the footprint, or if you say, we're only going to allow defensive operations or logistics, no invasion front from my territory. Those are ways to try to manage the domestic politics of granting access. Okay, so putting all of this together, what are the theoretical expectations that I want to draw out? So why do states grant, restrict, or deny access? And focusing on this 1945 to the present period. So on net, states are generally going to calculate that their security is advanced by granting access. They expect alignment benefits. They expect protection from retaliation and management of spillover. So states grant wartime access when the expected post-war alignment benefits are high or moderate and domestic politics are not strongly opposed. So where do the restrictions and denials come from? States restrict wartime access when the expected security benefits are high, but the domestic politics are strongly opposed. And states will deny wartime access when anticipated security benefits are moderate and the domestic politics are strongly opposed. when the anticipated security benefits are weaker and the public opinion or the elite factions are strongly opposed to granting access. This is my 2x2 political science. Put these two variables together. What do you get? 4 boxes. But note that 2 of those boxes are grant and 1 is restrict, and only 1 is deny, and map that on to the overall pattern of a permissive environment for wartime access in this period. Okay, I do want to flag a few other additional factors that shape wartime access decisions. So I don't think those are the only factors that matter. I don't think anything is that simple. I think a lot of factors are going to matter, and it's going to be really complicated. It's going to be different in different states. I'm trying to pull out useful patterns, but I still expect to see other factors kind of come into play. So some of those factors would be economic interdependence, legitimacy of the operation, leader or population identity, maybe cash payments from the US. Hey, I'll let you in if you give me X billion dollars. And so I want to like some of these variables could operate through an intervening variable of domestic politics, or they could operate independently and shape the calculation of a leader without that intervening variable of domestic politics. So I tend to think that these factors would, if they're operative, are mostly going to operate through a domestic politics intervening variable and less going to be about the leader's decision being kind of coming from them directly. Okay, so how am I getting after this question? So I'm employing a multi-method research design. So I can do some things I haven't been able to do in previous projects because I have a lot of money for this project. Somehow the Defense Security Cooperation Agency's Defense Security Cooperation University survived Doge and still exists and is still funding research. And so with a grant from the DoD, I can build an original data set on wartime access decisions. I've got a team of RAs and a really good graduate student I'm working with. His name is Peter Rogers. Look out for him. So what is this original data set that I'm building? So the coverage, I'm looking at state wartime access decisions within 11 significant US-led combat operations since 1945. So you see I've added Operation Epic Fury at the bottom there. I'd really like this is a long-term project, so I'm hoping that the data becomes available to look at Operation Epic Fury. Okay, so the unit, so how did I choose these cases? So operations are chosen for scale, significance, and variation in the factors that I'm interested in, as well as region, mission, and international legitimacy. I'm not looking at wars that the US fights right close to home because access won't matter. So I'm not really gonna look at the Venezuela operation, for instance. Though I think there was some access involved, it wasn't critical to the operation. So what's the unit of analysis here? I'm looking at states' wartime access decisions within each operation. So the unit of analysis is not 11 operations, it's around 85 observations of state decisions within each operation. So if a state changes its mind a few times, then there are going to be a few observations of that state. So I'm thinking about Turkey, Operation Inherent Resolve. Turkey changes its mind kind of regularly. Turkey will lift a restriction, add a restriction, and so Turkey would have that number. Every time Turkey would change an access decision, it would get a new observation in the data set. Okay, there are a few things though to say about this. It's pretty hard to figure out where the US wanted access but didn't ask because it preemptively knew that the state was going to be a no, and so it didn't bother. That's a pretty hard thing to get at. So there's going to be a data missing. I wanted just to flag some of my research challenges. I'm like not sure why. I really want you to know what's going to be really hard about this. That's going to be a really hard thing about this. Trying to figure out where the US didn't bother to ask because it preemptively knew it was going to be a no. I would like conceptually to count that as a no. I don't want to leave that out and overstate all the yeses and not explain those dogs that didn't bark, the cases that were no. So that's something that I'm trying to get after qualitatively. I'm something that maybe, looking at operational plans, doing interviews, talking to planners about where they would optimally like to fly from and fight from could help me get after kind of the missing data there. But that's going to be a challenge that I'm trying to get after. Okay. Okay, so for each observation within the data set, like what am I doing? So I'm coding the dependent variable as grant, restrict, or deny, and I'll also note changes in the level of restrictions as that's relevant. And so for the independent variables, I want to capture kind of complicated, complex factors like states' expectations regarding post-war alignment benefits, their expectations around retaliation, their expectations around spillover and domestic opposition. And I also want to get some of these other factors too. How much are we seeing economic interdependence factor in, legitimacy of the operation, identity, cash payments. So again, I want to flag what's hard about this and what I don't want to do. What I really don't want to do, my like biggest kind of pet peeve in social science, is bad data sets with bad proxies that don't actually conceptually get after the fact that what the researcher is trying to get after. So, I can't think of a good proxy variable for retaliation. Contiguity with the state, I don't think captures it. Balance of power between the target state, and the access granting state isn't going to cover it. Those factors aren't going to be good proxies for fear of retaliation. I want to know how the leader who made the choice was thinking about retaliation. Were they in talks with the United States saying, I'm worried about retaliation. What are you going to do to protect me? That's a level of information that I want in the data set. So that's going to be, for other variables, it'll be pretty easy. I think that actually UN authorization is a really good proxy variable for the legitimacy of an operation. So it's not all bad news, like it's not all that difficult, but there are going to be some really tricky independent variables to code at scale. But I'm pretty committed to coding them at scale and not relying on bad proxies. I'm basically going to do mini case studies for every observation to try to really get after, what is actually going on and coding them with high fidelity to what leaders were actually thinking. And the reason I can do that, again, is money. I can, and not being in a rush. So I have money and I have time. So I'm going to do a lot of reading, and my research assistants are going to do a lot of reading. And together we're going to build a data set that isn't full of bad proxies, but really captures these things. And also 85 observations, that's not thousands of operations. That's a limited case universe. That's manageable. Okay, and I want to pair this new data set with case studies. So basically, you're already going to be doing case studies to populate each observation of the data set, but I want to flesh some of them out. And I want to draw out in particular, and for inclusion in an eventual book, within war case comparisons, within war comparisons of access decisions. And then I also envision, a very long appendix of many case studies. And the data for this is going to be, a lot of secondary sources. There's some really good scholarship on Jordan and Turkey's decision makings in Gulf I, Gulf II. Also archives and interviews for the contemporary cases. I'm doing for time. Yeah. Okay. Okay, so this project is really early days. I haven't reached empirical conclusions. What I want to do is just briefly present two kind of illustrative sketches of the sort of within war paired comparisons that I'm doing, with the caveat that this research, even in these cases, is ongoing. So I want to start just talking about Desert Storm, and in particular, Turkey and Jordan in Desert Storm. So just leveling background, Saddam Hussein invades Kuwait, US says leave, Saddam says no, US and a coalition decide to make him leave. The US moves a huge amount of combat power to the region in Operation Desert Shield, just to make the point that it's serious and to prepare to throw Saddam Hussein out if he declined to leave. So then Operation Desert Storm. So focusing just on the air power element, the coalition conducted a total of 118,661 sorties, is the Gulf War Air Power Survey, against Iraq, 85% of which were conducted by the United States and 15% conducted by the rest of the coalition members. And the US conducted some of those sorties from naval aviation, from aircraft carriers in the Gulf, but the vast majority of the US air power for Operation Desert Storm, and 70% of total air power, was tactical air power from within the borders of the Gulf states. So most Gulf states granted access. Turkey was one of those states. So President Turgut Özal of Turkey, to the consternation of some of the traditional power players in Turkish foreign policy, played a really outsized role in Turkey's wartime access decisions in 1991. And he viewed alignment with the United States, the benefits, as extremely high. This is the end of the Cold War. Turkey's value for NATO had been proximity to Moscow. What's it going to be now? Proximity to the Middle East. So he viewed alignment with the granting access as an opportunity to shore up Turkey's value in NATO, make the point that, oh no, we still have something concrete to offer you, so we're of value to you. So very high expected post-war alignment benefits of granting access. The retaliation story in this case is pretty interesting. So he himself was not super worried about retaliation, but the military was. The Turkish military had just done a bunch of war games showing that the Iraqi army was going to crush them. And they were really worried about the Iraqi Air Force. So the Turkish military was opposed to granting access to the US on the grounds that they would be retaliated against. So Özal did a mix. He overrode those concerns and he also addressed them. So long story short, so he overrode them by saying, no, we're going to let the US in. There were votes, there were machinations, there was a lot that I'm simplifying here. But the decision was ultimately yes, but in order to make sure that he addressed the military's concerns about retaliation, he was going to make sure that US and British fighter aircraft were in to help handle the Iraqi Air Force. So access as the solution to the concern of access. So you're worried that granting access is going to get you retaliated against, but oh, if you grant access, you can get protection against retaliation. So Ozal was quite worried that granting wartime about the Kurds. He was very worried about what the post-war environment was going to look like, whether there would be a Kurdish state in northern Iraq. But he thought, well, this war is happening, and maybe it's better if I grant access, and I'll be able to get a seat at the table to try to shape that future in a way that is better for me. And then to the domestic politics. So Turkish public opinion is opposed. Turkey's foreign policy history, opposed to having foreign forces on their soil, opposed, pro-neutrality, just going against the grain on this. But the real opposition came from the Turkish military. This was like an elite factions domestic politics story. And you would think that Ozal would be pretty worried about the concerns about opposition from the military, given the history of coups. But it comes down to this moment in time. And this was the end of the Cold War, where Turkey's first, second, and third priority was demonstrating value to NATO. And one thing that would get them in trouble with NATO would be a coup. So Ozal calculated that basically this is a coup-free moment. He was at liberty to push against something that he might be worried about normally, because not in this moment, not in this precarious moment with NATO. Okay. So what are my theoretical expectations here? So given the extremely high perceived benefit of alignment with the US, and in particular the view that granting access would be a good way to get, to show that you're in good with NATO, but in the context of pretty heavy domestic opposition, so I'd expect that Turkey should grant but restrict US military wartime access, and that's what Turkey did. So Ozal denied a US request to allow the coalition to open a second ground front against Iraq from Turkish soil. He put a lot of restrictions on what NATO could do, what they could do from Incirlik. But precisely in order to guard against retaliation, also let in combat aircraft and then combat operations from Turkey. Okay, that was kind of a fast snapshot of Turkey, and I'm going to move on now to the big surprise no of 1991. So King Hussein, the Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan, shuttled around the region, trying to prevent the war from happening, trying to find an Arab solution to the problem, trying to make sure that this war wasn't going to happen. Okay, in vain. There is going to be a war. And the US is asking for access. So what's going into the calculation? So expectations of post-war alignment for granting access. This is hard to code, and I want to talk about the difficulty of having objective measures for coding something like this. But I'm basically coding alignment expectations of what do you get from giving the US what it wants, as moderate, more moderate than Turkey in the same moment in time, and complicated by a desire to also be in good graces with Iraq, which at the time was perceived as a power player and something the US was going to go home after the war, right? And Jordan would be stuck there carrying the bag. So an idea that we're between a rock and a hard place. We value our relationship with the US, but we also value our relationship with Iraq. We also have some pretty serious disagreements with the United States over foreign policy, in particular Israel. But on the whole, when evaluated from a balance of threat perspective, Jordan probably should have granted access if security was the primary motivator. You would sort of expect that direction. So, okay, concerns about retaliation and spillover, pretty low. Scholars of the decision-making at the time didn't really rate concerns of retaliation or refugee flows as particularly salient in King Hussein's decision-making. Where the focus was is domestic politics, overwhelming public opposition to Jordan joining the coalition on behalf of the United States against an Arab state. And this political crisis came in the wake also of a series of political crises in Jordan, stemming primarily from economic conditions, discontent fueled by economic conditions. So overwhelming opposition to Jordan helping the United States fight Iraq. Okay, so against this backdrop of a moderate perceived benefits of aligning with the US and very strong domestic political headwinds, I expect a deny, and that is what we see here. But I do want to emphasize, this all boils down to how you code these variables, and I haven't yet come up with what I think is a clear, defensible, objective way to measure this key variable of how much do you think you're going to get from the United States if you side with them. And there's a strong case to be made that, that I should have put Jordan in this box, that the expected security benefits of aligning with the United States were really high. I ended up putting Jordan there because I thought, clearly lower expected benefits than Turkey in the same period, and a much more complicated security calculation, given also this desire to have some alignment with Iraq. So I put it as moderate, but if I put it as high, then the theory would fail here, right? I should have gotten a restriction if I'd put it here. So I just want to highlight kind of how difficult the coding choices are, and also how important getting the coding right is going to be for testing theoretical expectations. Okay, so kind of come back to the big picture here. Those were just the briefest of sketches of two cases. But so what I'm trying to do is provide a first cut explanation of wartime access, which is an alignment decision that does a lot to explain why and how the United States can project military power all over the world, and thus does a lot to explain the shape of the world we live in. So the dynamics of wartime access, a live war combined with proximity, mean that existing explanations of other kinds of alignment and coalition decisions are not going to be the whole story. And I also want to emphasize an explanation of wartime access is also an explanation of the balance of military power in war. So explaining wartime access decisions can also help to explain war outcomes, such as duration, scale, who wins and loses. It's also likely an overlooked cause of war. So if the United States can't project military power because everybody says no, then it can't project military power. There are wars that the US wouldn't fight if it couldn't. There are also probably wars that states aren't fighting because they expect the US to project their military power and stop it. So that's not something I'm researching, but it's an extension of the project that I'd like to pursue. This question of, is wartime access also a cause of war or peace? So talking about some policy implications. Okay, so Iran, it's too soon to say. What's going on is hazy to me. I can't say anything with certainty about this, but given the scale of the combat operations underway, it does not seem to me like the United States could be conducting Operation Epic Fury or anything close to it without wartime access from states in the region. And its ability to sustain those operations against Iran are going to hinge on the continued willingness of states to allow it to project power from within their borders. And then I want to just talk for a moment about Taiwan. So the United States can't defend Taiwan without wartime access. Or in the analysis that Daryl Press and Nick Anderson are doing, and the analysis that I'm doing, it seems like that would be a death knell to a U.S. effort to defend Taiwan. So what decisions would partners in the region, allies and partners in the region make? What would South Korea say to the U.S. Air Force using its hardened aircraft shelters? Probably no, but maybe yes. Maybe what would push to yes? Japan, the Philippines, Indonesia, and Australia. What factors would shape their wartime access decisions? Okay, so now I just want to look to the future. All right, actually, quickly on Taiwan. So I've been talking about a 1945 to the present world where retaliation fears are relatively under control because of a US preponderance of power and an ability to credibly promise protection from retaliation. Would that be true in a Taiwan scenario? Probably not, right? The US would have a pretty hard time credibly promising to protect Japan, South Korea, all the states that it would fly from PRC missiles. So this dynamic is likely to be different. Okay, so this is kind of a segue into looking to the future. So the empirical focus of this project so far is 1945 to today. And so the factors that elevated the perceptions of alignment benefits and sort of kept fears of retaliation under control may be shifting. And we might be seeing that shift real time in Iran right now. So if the US power position declines, then the benefits of granting access are going to go down, and it will take smaller costs to push states to restrictions and denials. And looking at Operation Epic Fury and thinking about a Taiwan scenario, I'm thinking fears of retaliation are likely to get a lot more salient and going to push a lot more states to say no, to restrict or to deny. And so that's attributable to a shift in the balance of power. It's also attributable to a shift in military technology, so drones and missiles. And then I also want to say, the global power projection of the US military is a choice that the United States makes. The value of access to the United States is determined by US appetite, right? The United States doesn't necessarily, it depends on what the US wants to do in the world. If the US wants to be able to shape global affairs everywhere in the world, then wartime access is crucial. If the US's appetite goes down, well, then wartime access is a little bit less significant. If the US pursues a hemispheric defense that cares about the North America, Latin America, and that's it, okay, this access question would be less important. But I also want to flip the direction of that causality. If states start saying no, then the US appetite might have to go down. And it's not just about the US. If other states want to project military power far away, they're going to try to get access from other states. And so what's going to drive other states' decisions to grant, restrict, or deny access to, say, a China, a Russia, other states that I haven't looked at empirically, but are going to be important? Okay, so thank you all so much for your time and attention. And now I look forward to your feedback. And as I've emphasized, this is very new research. And so the downside of presenting new research is I'm kind of showing you the kinks and how the sausage is getting made and the problems that I'm wrestling with. But that's really also what I see as the upside of presenting this stage of work. So I'm hoping that you're kind of, oh, you haven't thought of this, or you have to work on that. We're at the ground floor on this project, so I can really take all of your suggestions on board. So thanks so much for your time, and looking forward to the conversation.
Great. Thank you, Rachel. Sit back here. Oh, what a great talk. Thank you so much. It's a great project, and I'm so glad you did present it, because it's super interesting for us. And we'll go to a couple questions here, and then I've already got a couple questions online. So we're going to go back and forth. I'll read the online questions.
Okay.
But we'll start with Austin, and then we'll go back to Tom, and then we'll go over here to Elizabeth, Kevin, and Emily, and I will write that down. Okay. And just introduce yourself for Rachel. So.
Austin River right now. And so I have a comment and a question for you. One that I would say, especially as you're developing this project, that I find interesting is on the methodology side. That really supports your argument is I would say that in your sortie simulation, segregating before and after air superiority has been declared, because if you have high demand, low density assets, coalition partners are probably more likely to participate after the direct threat.
Yeah, that's such a good point. So that's a retaliation mechanism.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And so I think that actually would support your argument in that. The question is, when you look at the 2x2 specifically, I was interested in why the benefit was restricted to security. So when you look at grant versus deny, it's pretty clear. But in the restricted area, when you start getting into, say, logistic support, most of the time, and so Turkey supports kind of the security high medium part, but a lot of the times countries don't want to be attributable to it, but they want the economic benefit of it. And so there's countries that'll say, hey, you can move logistics through here, but it can't be marked as military items. And so there's a high economic benefit.
What's the economic benefit being? A payoff from the US or something else?
I mean, in a sense, but it's transactional in nature, right? Like you're going to use your transportation systems, those types of things. So you are gaining an economic benefit, but not necessarily a security benefit. So I was just kind of curious on the 2x2, if there was a reason to limit it just to security benefits as far as granting and denying and restricting.
There is no reason to rule out a whole bunch of other factors that are almost certainly going to come into play. My starting kind of armchair logic is I think when we're talking about war, security variables tend to come to the fore, and that you have time to think about everything else if your security is assured. So first and foremost, what's your risk on the actual battlefield today? That's sort of my starting prior and logic, that will be the number one issue that is first front of mind. And it's only after that security is assured that these other factors will come to play. I could be wrong. That could be wrong. Economic factors could be the most salient factors in the minds of decision makers. It's not so far what I've seen in most of the cases that I've looked at, but I've only started to look at these cases, and there are 85-ish and growing observations to look at. So I'm not ruling out economic factors. I'm more interested to see how they come into play. Yeah, I'll leave it there.
I'm going to go to Tom and Elizabeth, and then I'm going to go to Herb and Tracy online, and then I'm going to come back here for Kevin, Emily, and Sitara.
Thanks very much. Tom Dannenbaum here and at the law school. So I wanted to, perhaps unsurprisingly, given that, ask you a question about law, because you raised the issue of the legitimacy of the operation, but typically we distinguish questions of legitimacy from questions of law. And it's striking that both Spain and the United Kingdom, in Spain's case, in denying the use of bases altogether, in the United Kingdom's case, in restricting them specifically to the defense of Gulf states that have been attacked by Iran in response as part of the retaliation, have framed it explicitly in legal terms. And it's very obvious that they're acting on legal advice. So there's a question of the degree to which you want to separate out legitimacy from law and assess the illegality or not of the operation. And then perhaps related to that, think also about the degree to which the state in question has a high or low degree of legal exposure, because it's one question whether the operation is lawful or unlawful. And there's a second question as to the degree to which that particular state is likely to face consequences associated with being embroiled in an illegal act. And there are various different proxies one could use for that, but there's an additional component to it that I think is likely to become more relevant going forward for the United States in particular, which is that's all about the legality of the war as a whole. There's a separate question as to the legality of operations within the war. And the United States, having eliminated the TJAGs and coming into the new administration, eliminated the Civilian Harm Reduction Office, etc., is much more likely to be engaged in war crimes and other violations of international humanitarian law going forward than it may have been going previously. And if we think about that specifically in the context of Taiwan and the states that you mentioned, Indonesia and the Philippines, not party to the International Criminal Court, the Philippines was, but is no longer. Japan, South Korea, and Australia are. So the level of legal exposure for senior political and military actors in those states, if they become attached to illegal acts by the United States in that conflict, is much greater. And so the likelihood that that will play a role, independent of domestic politics and independent of the other kinds of factors that you're mentioning, I think is greatest. That's maybe something additional to include.
Were you saying anything? Rose had a two-finger. So.
Yeah.
I turned it off.
Oh, you haven't. Thank you. Really interesting and very thought-provoking, Rachel. And I'm going to jump in on Tom's because I was thinking about treaty relationships. And in the case of, when you talk about like what's going on now with Spain and the UK, this is not a NATO operation that would be pursuant to the Washington Treaty and an Article 5 commitment. But if there is an Article 5 commitment being called upon, then that's different. It has a different legal status from these other operations. So it's something to think about. It's gotten tangled up in the Taiwan case because of Biden appearing to treat Taiwan as a treaty ally, even though it is not, in the same way that ROK and Japan are, and Australia and New Zealand for that matter. So in the case of some kind of Taiwan incident, this could become quite intertwined if there's an expectation of escalation to war against our treaty allies in the region. So it's very tricky, and I think it's well worth spending some more time talking about. So I wanted to endorse Tom's comment and say, think about treaty alliance relationships and how they might affect what you're trying to do.
I think that's a really good point. I think it is important to separate legality and legitimacy. They're not the same thing, and they should be treated separately. So whereas legitimacy, I think, can be relatively decently proxied by UN authorization, legality is a can of worms. It's going to be difficult, but important, as you both suggested, to track. So one thing that comes to mind based on Rose's comments, I'm thinking about Operation El Dorado Canyon against Libya in 1986.
Now that was really an interesting one.
It was a really interesting one.
NATO got called on, but
NATO got called on. Spain and France said you can't even fly, no overflight. So sent pilots from based in the UK on a roundabout mission.
They have a lot more tanker support.
A lot more tanker support, a really long flight, and some accidents. And so, I guess the way I would think about, not just coding legality and Article 5 in a given case is if I code it across all cases, do states predictably make their access decisions based on what value legal exposure, to use your language, or treaty relationships, to use yours, take? So thinking about, Operation El Dorado Canyon, that would be one case where I'd think, okay, doesn't seem to be like it's predicting the within war variation I'm seeing in this particular case, given that, these are 3 states, 1 says yes, 2 says no, it's the same war. I don't think the legal exposure would be, I would have to look into it more deeply. I hadn't thought about it from that perspective. My my sense of that case would be, okay, that's not the decisive factor in that case. Interestingly, fun fact, Margaret Thatcher overruled her cabinet to say yes to Reagan. So there was a lot of pressure in the UK to say no as well. But that particular operation, I think, could probably have been done from the sea. So, that one wouldn't necessarily have been a game changer. But that's a bit of an aside, but suffice to say, I agree. I take the suggestion on board, and I will look at legality as well.
Yeah, this is going to be a long project. I'm sorry to jump in with just one more comment that complicates it, but now all this talk about coalitions of the willing inside NATO. So no longer, this stark consensus driven by the necessity of consensus under the Washington Treaty, but coalitions of the willing taking shape in various settings. So anyway, more complex.
Yeah.
Elizabeth.
Hi, thank you so much. Elizabeth Good, CSAC postdoc. This was great. And one of the things that kind of I wasn't able to get out of was with your premise of this idea that war is happening regardless. And so my question is, what happens when the US is seen as the aggressor? And you kind of got at this as like, this can be a future research project, but it felt very tied into your 2x2. So the idea that like by granting access, you're actually enabling war next door that otherwise potentially wouldn't happen. And so I'm wondering if there should be a third variable kind of in this 2x2 where you have high and medium security benefits, but there also seems to be a negative benefits or a low security benefits by enabling this conflict. And then I'm very guilty to have a second question that pertains to consent. And this is the idea that states say yes because they think the US is going to do it anyway. And it weakens them to say no and then have the US come in and do it anyway. So they say yes.
They think that the US will put military forces in their territory, even if they say no.
So it presents as stronger to just say yes or give a restricted kind of access, and how that shows up in the data, if at all.
Okay, I'm going to go reverse order on this. So I think that overflight is the most likely thing the US would just ignore a no on. So if a state says no to the US for overflight, I mean, in this case of Spain and France, the US listened and said, okay, no overflight. I don't think the US would always listen when it comes to overflight. I'm not aware of a lot of examples of states saying no to combat operations from inside their borders and the US ignoring it and conducting combat operations from inside their borders. That's pretty close to invasion of that state. It's blurry. It's possible it exists. If it does exist, then it calls into question the importance of asking, why do states grant, restrict, or deny access? If they say no and the US says too bad, then who cares about their decisions, right? Empirically, I don't see that so much, but maybe I'm missing it. So one answer to the question is yes, I could see states saying, yes, I granted overflight to avoid appearing weak. And yeah, another way of seeing this is the opposite. States say to their domestic populations that they said no, when in fact they said yes. And that's a domestic politics management thing. So they price in a little bit of appearing weak for the benefit of saying to their populations, we didn't want this, we're on your side, but quietly saying yes to the United States. So I think it could go the opposite direction too. Your first question about whether states, whether they grant access or not based on whether they think that decision affects whether the war happens at all. I think that's a really good question. And I think because the US asks so many states at once, so think about the invasion of Iraq. Turkey said no, right, to the Northern Front, and the US invaded Iraq. It invaded Iraq from Kuwait, Jordan. It had access to other states in the region. So Turkey's no was not prohibitive. I don't think Turkey expected its no to be prohibitive in 2003. I think Turkey knew that the war was still going to happen, even if it said no.
Actually, just to correct it real quick, because I was there.
Yeah.
I was the flight surgeon responsible for combat rescue operations up north. But so actually the plan all along was 3rd Infantry Division with the Marines was going to come from the south from Kuwait, and then 4th ID was going to come down. So they 4th ID ended up going there, but they, it was after, kind of the initial invasion from the south. But anyway.
Yeah, no, I mean, yeah. So it's good. Yeah, I would love to
Yeah, we
talk
can
to you
talk
after
offline. Yeah.
about the Turkey case, 2003. But okay, so I guess the short answer to your question is I think states think the war is going to happen whether they individually grant access or not. It's a collective action problem. If all the Gulf states want the war to not happen, all the Gulf states would have to say no together. I think that's what they think is going on. Like, I think they think, okay, we could say no, but if we say no, a neighbor of ours is probably going to say yes. So the war is going to happen. So what's in our best interest given that the war is going to happen? That's what's been going on in the cases that I've seen, but I haven't looked at all the cases yet. So I'm going to watch for that because I think it's really important. It also sort of, it undercuts the argument in another way, which is like, I'm saying wartime access matters a lot. And if I'm saying then actually whether a state says yes or no, the war is going to happen anyway, I have to kind of amend the argument a little bit to say, it's about the collective of access. The US needs access from some route to be able to make a war happen, but it doesn't necessarily need yes from everywhere. So I think a way to get at that piece of it would be to get into operational plans. Like, what would the ideal structure of a military operation be? Where would the US want to fight from precisely? And then, how does it have to modify its plans based on who says yes or no? And are there any no's that would be prohibitive in and of themselves? So thinking about, Operation Enduring Freedom, the US needs access. Afghanistan's landlocked, but it could get some individual no's as long as it gets a few important yeses. So yeah, it's an important question.
So I'm going to go online, and we have a question from Herb Lynn. You seem to define wartime access as being for air power. Perhaps consider sea power, especially basing and also repair during an extended war. How would including sea power alter your analysis?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I focused mostly on air power just because I wanted to start somewhere, and it felt like the in-between service. If you think about land power, certainly, obviously, you need access. You're not going to put large formations into a state. I mean, you can do an amphibious invasion. That's really hard. But land power, very access dependent. Sea power, still access dependent, but the least access dependent of the services, I would say. That's the point of the aircraft carrier. But to Herb Lynn's point, aircraft carriers are tied to land. Sea power is still tied to land. So I think I'd probably see less significance of wartime access in sea power, but still plenty of it, particularly if I look not just at allowing combat operations, but allowing the logistics, allowing the resupply and the refueling. I think, the full treatment of this would look at all domains. And I think on net, the answer would be similar, but I think sea power would lead to a slightly weaker argument in the sense that, sea power is a little bit less access dependent than air power. Which, though, to be fair to my choice of air power, is also, less dependent than land power. And also, why choose air power? Another reason to choose air power is, look at Operation Epic Fury. We like air power. The United States likes air power. The US does a lot of air power. It's a tool of first resort. It's the preferred way of doing business. And so studying air power, by choosing air power to start with, it's a way to kind of hit most of what the US has done since 1945.
And Tracy Wilson is looking at Europe. First of all, she says this is timely research. As a military brat who went to high school on a US base in Germany, I always wonder why European states get so little credit for hosting US bases in the criticism over the 2% and now 5% NATO military funding guidelines. Access is very valuable, including for hosting training grounds, forward deployed weapons, weapons platforms, surveillance assets, refueling facilities, time-critical military hospital facilities. Wouldn't the US become a hemispheric power without such broad access? And another way of putting this is, will the administration realize how important the Europeans are and stop bashing them, given what they see they need?
I think that's a really nice way of saying you agree with I think we're in agreement. So I'll touch on a couple points that you raised. So one of them is just the defense, the burden sharing debates, both in policy and in scholarship, miss this entirely. I'd say that's more international relations scholarship is more guilty about it of that than practitioners. Practitioners, you touch the DoD, you immediately know that the DoD cares about access. But the political discourse around burden sharing, and NATO in particular, is defense spending and what did you do in Afghanistan? And so I agree with the thrust of this comment and question, which is there is another way that states contribute that has less to do with the money that they spend on defense in peacetime and a lot more to do with what they let the US military do, both in peacetime and in wartime inside their borders. Yeah, I mean, I also think the dynamics of peacetime access, which is what you're mostly talking about, and wartime access are different. So the reasons I separate them is I think the causes and the consequences are different. So in terms of the consequences, peacetime access might be for deterrence, not for war winning or, battlefield outcomes. It's to try to avoid a war. It might also be to improve battlefield outcomes, but it's one of the reasons I separate them is the purposes can be different. And also the causes can be different. The security implications of granting access in peacetime are different than when the war is real. And then domestic politics can be different. So I don't think I'm going to study them together. I think that they are worth studying separately.
Great, thank you. Kevin.
Thank you for this wonderful talk. First thing was I had a similar thought to Elizabeth regarding this question of consent, in which you answered, the way she framed it and the way you answered it was very much sort of like ignoring consent. But the way I was sort of thinking about it was how much coercion is there in sort of acquiring these sorts of consents? And so, I mean, that's a different question, but it just might be worth looking through what the case material tells you. The real question that I had was regarding conceptualization. So, you're thinking about security benefits, retaliation, and spillover. And I guess I wonder how much of this is grounded in a state-centric framework. So most of your cases are in the post-Cold War period. So I wonder how much of that is a valid way to think about explaining your dependent variable. So like in the Desert Storm case, right? Like there is the possibility of Iraqi retaliation, right? But how much is that actually applicable in a Afghanistan situation, right? Like how much can you actually say that, I mean, not you, but how much can you actually find the evidence of we'll give you security benefits against these non-state actors operating in the region versus like a protection against a state aggressor? And so like, I wonder if it's worth unpacking these concepts a bit more to think like through state retaliation, non-state retaliation, and also regarding this question of spillovers, right? Where it's like, it might not just be massive inflows of refugees are also their own sort of security risks. And so like how do you actually like manage all these things together?
Yeah, well, there are too many things and the concepts are too muddy right now. I mean, I have some conceptual clarification I still need to do. The theory isn't where I want it to be yet. It's not done. It's in progress. And I think a lot of the comments here are raising some of the muddiness and some of the key areas. And so I'm hoping just as I keep going with this, I think I will be able to bring more clarity to each of the buckets. But sort of one of your comments makes me think about, what was the concern for El Dorado Canyon, these strikes against Gaddafi and the regime in Libya? The concern was terrorist attacks, reprisals in the UK and in Spain and France. Like that was part of the concern. So this is a non-state fear of reprisal, even though the states were a little further away, there's water in between. They weren't worried that the Libyan state was going to retaliate against them, but they were worried about terrorist retaliation. So I guess the question there is, I could still conceptualize that as, is fear of retaliation, affecting the choice? And is the US doing something to mitigate the fear of retaliation? And I could bucket those the same. I could say, it's the same whether Margaret Thatcher is worried about terrorist attacks in the UK, in London. Can I say that's the same as Japan worrying about missile strikes? Conceptually, I'm not convinced that I have to separate them. I think the logic is similar and the ability of the US to protect might still be the decisive factor. And the US actually might have less ability to protect against a terrorist reprisal than it would a state actor. So it might kind of work in an unexpected direction. So I want to think more about it, but my instinct on this is that's not the biggest problem that's been raised, not the biggest muddying problem that's been raised, because it would boil down to a concern about retaliation, whether that comes from a state or a terrorist group, and to the US's ability to manage that risk.
Didn't the Libyans still blow up an airliner though? I think that may have been one of the things that went into,
Yeah.
people's fears, but
And motivated the attacks, the US strikes.
I'm gonna take two at a time, so be prepared.
Yes.
Okay. So I'm gonna do.
Oh, I missed one of it. May I answer
okay,
one question?
yes.
I'm sorry, I have this note here. How much coercion is there in access diplomacy? So usually what I've seen is how much money can we throw at you to get to yes? So I've seen the cases I've looked at, I've seen less coercion than I've seen carrots. A lot of what is the dollar amount that it'll take to get to a yes. So I haven't seen the US say, I will penalize you in some way. Another way to think about that would be, do states that deny access get penalized after? It's a research question that I want to look at that I haven't. So do they get punished after? I don't know the answer to that, but it's something I would want to, I think it's an important question to look at. But my guess is actually no. My guess is actually that the US, just given some other work that I've done looking at how the US likes to operate with partners, the US likes to do inducements and does not like often to coerce its partners, or previous iterations of the US at least.
Just a comment on that, because I, prior to this administration, was serving on the State Department International Security Advisory Board, and the Undersecretary for International Security and Arms Control asked us to do a study trying to understand the ROI on security assistance, and sort of how we would measure that. And we got dozens of briefings from across the government.
I worked on one of those reports.
The DOD, I mean, like every briefing, I mean, totally clear. We're looking for ABO. We're looking for access, basing, and overflight rights. If we get that, whatever we spent, totally worth it. Like, doesn't matter how much we spend. We get that, it's worth it. It was interesting because talked to the State Department, how do you think? I'm totally muddied in terms of how they thought about it. I mean, there was no clear idea. But in terms of thinking about return on investment, the DoD was very clear. If we get those things, spend whatever we have to spend, fine.
Yeah, I mean, just riffing on that for a sec. One of the things that got me interested in this was there's a theory in the DoD, and part of the reason my project is being funded is, how does security cooperation shape choices to grant access? And the problem with some of the security cooperation theories of getting to access is it's all about mil-mil diplomacy when the decision maker is going to be a head of state. These are civilian head of state decisions when it comes to wartime access. So the extent to which mil-mil diplomacy is going to percolate up to shaping an access decision, you have to connect a lot of dots to get to that. But I think it's one of the main, you hear this a lot in the security cooperation world, is we really care about access, so we got to do this mil-mil diplomacy to get it. And what gets access, my guess is probably not mil-mil diplomacy. It may be, depending on the civil-military relations of the state, the positions of power that the military percolates up to, but I think there are reasons to be skeptical of some of the theories of reaching access that are operative right now.
Okay, we got Emily and Satara, and then we'll have Jim and Dippin, but Mike has a two-finger.
So as a practitioner, I will say, from the defense side, every country I've worked in has argued that routinization of military presence and forces actually advantages ABO in wartime, because it's easier to say yes, it's been there before, than it is to say yes for the first time.
I think that is the best theory of security cooperation as a driver of access decisions. If it's easy, you might not be able to affect the head of state's decisions through it, but if it's really easy to do because you've been practicing it, then it might be something that that happens more seamlessly than if you don't. But a head of state could still say no.
Okay, Emily, we met earlier, postdoc at CSAC. I wanted to just make sort of a suggestion that I had a very similar reaction to, I think, both Kevin and Elizabeth about consent, where you're focusing on the expected benefits, but the expected costs of denying may not be material in the same way, but could seriously set back the U.S. relations with that country and future expected gains in whether it's just like, we're trying to improve our relationship with the United States. Like, so I'm thinking like Turkey in 2003. And so I was just wondering if you wanted to alter that variable to be more of like a net security economic benefit of some sort of net. I mean, that would make it more complicated, obviously, but it could include the cash, like both the carrots and the sticks. And then I just wanted to know, I mean, we've been talking a lot about treaties, but how much of this is predicated on the predetermined like access from security assistance? Like how much of this can be predicted ex ante and how much does that need to be factored into the theory here?
This is, I think, sorry, okay.
Tara.
Thank you. A very good presentation. I'm Sitara Noor, postdoc fellow here at CSAC. And we didn't discuss it amongst ourselves before coming to the presentation, but my point is also with regards to consent and coercion. And I do want to emphasize on the fact that coercion actually does take place. And I think the amount of coercion is directly proportionate to what options US has. Is certain countries the only option, coercion would actually be really high. And reportedly, US would give statements like either you are with us or the terrorist, and if you do not cooperate, you would be bound back to the Stone Age. That was the case, Pakistan seeking Pakistan's cooperation in passage to Afghanistan. And I think in that case study, I think you can actually find all shades of acceptance, denial, restriction in certain stages, because depending upon the situation, how benefits were not provided the way they were promised at the beginning, especially saving the country from the spillover of the war in that country. That was definitely, I think, a case study in its own right in that case. And this discussion actually reminds me of, and that follows my question, reminds me of Henry Kissinger's quote that it's dangerous to be an enemy of the United States, but it is fatal to be friends with US. And how that would, and that I think becomes more prominent given how the spillover advertently or inadvertently is being inflicted upon the Middle Eastern allies in US. And how do you think that? I think you did mention partially to this point, but I if you can emphasize more on that or elaborate more on that, how would that you think would affect the behavior of the allies in if situation arises in Indo-Pacific with regards to Taiwan? Because I think how this war finishes and plays out would have a real impact, how allies' behavior would have an impact on determining allies' behavior in the Indo-Pacific region. How, to what an extent US, protects their interests and does not unjustifiably prioritize one partner on the other. So that, I think, would determine how allies would behave in the Indo-Pacific if push comes to the shove on the Taiwan's case. So that's, how do you see that?
Okay, I might not hit all points of both, but to your point about your question about whether peacetime access leads to wartime access. So this is where I think the Stacey Pettijohn and Jennifer Kavanaugh paper is really useful. They basically show the percentage of times that's true. And I forget the number, but it's not a whole lot. It's not predictive. You need independent explanations of wartime access that are not just is there pre-existing peacetime access. And it goes both ways. You could have peacetime access that then doesn't translate to wartime access, or you could have no access and then enduring, I'm thinking about an Operation Enduring Freedom, Afghanistan, no history of access in Kyrgyzstan. But after 2001, Afghanistan's landlocked, we got to get in, calling Putin apparently to tell Putin to tell Kyrgyzstan to let the US in. Interesting alignment dynamics there. But so I don't think that peacetime access is enough of a predictor of wartime access that you can make that leap. But that is relatively, there are a lot of pieces to this that are going to be really hard to figure out. That's going to be on the easier side to do. I'm going to move to this point. So on the coercion piece, thanks for raising Pakistan. One of my takeaways from today, both the IR workshop and this workshop, is I can do a lot more with some within case variation. And within case, what I'm talking about is within country changes and restrictions and grants. Because one of the problems in the paper that I presented earlier was, I'm talking about how variation in access shapes total military combat power, but the real way to get at that would be to look at how one state's changes in permissions shape the war. So from the previous workshop, Turkey is the suggested case, and from this workshop, Pakistan. I think that's an area that I can take away from my Stanford visit today as something to pursue. Spillover. So just briefly on spillover and retaliation. I think the U.S. can more concretely promise to manage retaliation than it can spillover. Spillover can come in a lot of forms, but economic disruption is going to be a difficult thing for the U.S. to credibly promise to take care of for an access granting state. But the distinction I draw between those cases is that for states just worrying about retaliation, whether they grant access or not is a big factor of whether they have reason to fear retaliation or not, versus for states worrying about spillover, unless they are the core state that if they say no, the war doesn't happen. If they're not that state, then the war is happening and they're going to suffer the consequences of the spillover no matter what they do, whether they grant access or not. And so they probably have a better shot getting some help managing the spillover if they get in the good graces of the powerful state. So I didn't take it to the Taiwan scenario specifically, but that's part of how I'm thinking about the retaliation spillover problems.
Of Jim and Dippin.
Jim, if you're on political science and FSI, thanks. Agree. I really, you've really identified, just remarkable blind spot in the alliance literature. Yeah, that's great. I have kind of just an informational question. So you said you had like 85 or so
Observations.
Yeah. Have you done enough that you could give us like the basic distribution, like the descriptive stats, like what percentage of cases were deny access, what were restrict, what were full access?
Yeah.
Hey, Dippin.
Thank you so much. I think you preempted most of what I was going to suggest in the form of a question, but I was wondering if there's any within case variation you can leverage about external security benefits. So is there a case where expected security benefits? Is there a case where security benefits were expected given what happens at time 2? Is there a case where expected security benefits were, and they were expected not given, and then what happens at time 2? Access, and given that the US has been so involved in the Middle East, I think there's enough multi-shot interactions that there might be something there.
Okay, reverse order. So interestingly, if I'm answering my question, I don't need to know what the US actually did, whether the US actually gave the benefit or not, to be able to answer the question, did an expectation of benefit shape the decision? But I think it's pretty important to know. Problem. If they work their way back, and so what I look for in the question is, did the US take away goodies from Jordan? Did they reduce investment in Jordan? I don't actually think there was. So maybe there could be a learning element here where states realize actually you can say no and nothing happens, and that might shape future, that might shape things. Or are states being irrational? Are they not looking around and seeing that the US actually does follow up? Or not. So I'm going to take that as a suggestion of something to look at.
But there's also the case of saying yes, not getting what you thought you were going to get, which I think is what Dippin was talking about. And because that might affect a future case, right? You go back to that same country later down the road and you're like, we need access. And you're like, well, we gave you access last time and you didn't give us what you said you were going to give us.
Yeah. Turkey comes to mind as a possibility.
And if it's not conditional, then you can really say, is it the expectation of benefit and not actual benefit, which is what you're arguing, right? And if it is conditional, then there's something different between the expectation and actual benefit there.
Yeah, thank you. I think I'm going to just need to track track that down in the cases. I think Turkey is an example of thinking that, oh, we're going to get so much good stuff from this, and then thinking, oh, actually, the Kurds are a bigger problem than they were before I started this. So to Jim's question, oh, okay, presenting a picture of the observational picture. So the yes and no. So of the 85 observations I have now, they're mostly yeses and light restricts, and there are about 20% denies. But
20% deny.
yeah, there's a lot of deny. There's more deny than I thought. But there would be more deny if I felt like I had my arms fully wrapped around all the preemptive no's, the ways that the US takes, preemptively decides not to even bother to ask. So I think I'm understating the no's a bit right now. I think there are more no's if I can find more cases that the US, and it's difficult conceptually to draw a line for what I'm looking for. Like, the US isn't going to ask for access in China to fight North Korea, to fight in the Korean War, right? So I don't really want to ask, that seems silly I'm not going to ask about that. So where's the line for, what cases should I include as potential no's that are.
What if you limited attention to cases where there was a prior agreement or something?
Well, then that would understate a lot of I mean, there's a lot of wartime access from states there was no prior agreement. Or are you suggesting no? So look for the no's by looking for the cases that.
Well, I think it might be interesting to know, conditional on we thought we had an ABO.
Yeah.
How often do they say no, actually?
Yeah. That would be a good way to start.
And just related to this, can you say a little bit about sort of the archival material that's available or the interviews that you hope to conduct?
Yeah. So first, I want to say secondary sources sometimes get a really bad rap in social science, and they shouldn't. There's a lot of really good scholarship on Jordan's decision-making in Gulf 1 and 2. There's a lot of really good scholarship on Turkey's decision-making in Gulf 1 and 2. And so my first cut for a lot of this is, where's there really good research already? So when
journalistic accounts as well, I assume we're not really?
I have not found them to be high fidelity.
Okay.
So far, I think so. So the New York Times, so public reporting is really good for identifying the decisions, a yes, a no, a restrict, a change to a decision, but less good for explaining the decision. So, but just first, I want to do a shout out to secondary sources, because when you're trying to do a project kind of this scale, like if I'm trying to do around 85 to 100 observations, like I need to start with what's already been done by really good scholars who are much more expert than I am in Jordan and in Turkey and in each of the cases. I'm not going to be an expert in 85 countries' decisions. And so I want to start with the expertise that is already there. So that's first. Second, interviews obviously only for contemporary cases, obviously. So, I mean, I was hoping Colin Call was going to be here. I was going to ask him. So basically, figuring out who was involved with operational planning for the invasion of Iraq, for instance, for inherent resolve, and talking to them about access diplomacy and what was the ideal operational plan and how did that access diplomacy go down. So interviews would start with American practitioners and then hopefully move to partner decision makers. So, it's one thing to say, what did the Americans say that was motivating the partners? And it's another thing to talk to the partners themselves. So I'm going to start with the lowest hanging fruit and then go to the slightly higher hanging fruit and then higher hanging fruit and kind of work backwards from there.
Great. Well, I said at the outset that we were really lucky to have Rachel here today. So I think you can see why I said that. And I'm just sorry that our time with George Washington did not overlap. So that's a pity. That's too bad for me. But
we overlapped here at Stanford.
But anyway, really, it was really just great having you here. It's a terrific project. We'll be really excited to see how it develops.
Thank you so much. Thank you, everyone, for having me here. This has been a really, really awesome day. Thank you.